Welcome, everyone. My name is Annette Johns, and I'm the Associate Director of Policy and Practice with the Newfoundland and Labrador College of Social Workers. I'm honored to be the moderator for today's education event, Building Stronger Coalitions, the essential role of coalition building and community engagement in health. We have over 140 social workers from across Newfoundland and Labrador registered for this event this afternoon. The webinar presentation will be approximately 45 minutes, followed by a 10-15 minute question and answer period that I will moderate. Please note that all the details you need, like how to access the slide deck and other housekeeping information, is under the announcement and housekeeping widget. All the widgets can be accessed by clicking the blue and white icons at the bottom of your window. You can also resize and move around any of the elements you see on your screen to customize your viewing experience. During the presentation, I encourage you to type in your questions using the question mark icon at any time, and I'll begin asking them at the end of the presentation. Only myself and the presenter can see the questions. So now I want to introduce our speaker, Priscilla Corcoran-Mooney. Priscilla has been working as a social worker since 2003 and has worked in long-term care and primary health care for most of that time. She is currently the primary health care manager with Eastern Health. Most of her social work experience is connected to community engagement. In her current role, Priscilla works with community advisory committees and with community health centers in rural areas and with the Refugee Health Collaborative. I was so excited when Priscilla reached out to facilitate this education webinar. As social workers, our work in community practice is so important and essential, and it's an area where social workers continue to seek education and new learning. So therefore, without further ado, I'll now pass the virtual podium over to Priscilla to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Annette, and good afternoon, everyone. And I guess I just want to begin by saying thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I know everyone who's on this call is having a very busy day, most likely. So thanks for taking the time out to listen. And also a big thank you to Annette and the college for allowing me to present this information today in this webinar. It's something that I'm very excited about and very invested in. As Annette had mentioned, I've been a registered social worker since 2003, and most of my social work life, and as I was reflecting on this, I think most of my life in general has been spent in the area of community development. And in the last year or so, in the pandemic world, my work life has switched over a little bit towards more of a clinical role and a leadership role within community health centres. And I've been trying to figure out, maybe you can help me, how I can bring some of this work around coalition building and community development to that work too. So hopefully we can have some good examples today that you can build upon. And I know we don't get to chat in a live way, but even in our chat box, we might be able to have some conversation back and forth around coalition building. So what we're going to look at today, I guess in terms of a bit of an agenda, we're going to look at what a coalition really is, why they're so important, the how-to of coalition building, and this might sound like an interesting piece, and it is, the good, the bad, and the very tangly of building coalitions, what makes them strong and effective, and then at the end, and I guess the meat and potatoes of all this, how can coalitions nurture healthy communities? Throughout the slides, you'll notice that I've incorporated some examples of coalitions throughout Eastern Health, throughout Canada, and also throughout the US. So they'll be interspersed throughout these slides. And also at the end, as Annette had mentioned, we'll have some time for questions. So I want to frame up right at the beginning coalition building within the context of community development. And I know that there are a lot of people on this call today who would know all kinds of ins and outs of community development. So, and I don't claim to be any expert at all, but in terms of some very basic principles of community development, first of all, and I don't think there's a more important time that we could say this, diversity is key, and we need to recognize and hear and truly understand as many voices and perspectives as possible. We need to recognize that everyone is a stakeholder. And I know in a lot of our work, we look at sectors and we use the term intersectoral collaboration, which is hugely important. But we also need to look at people outside of the realm of being in a sector. And I know in a lot of the work that I do when in committees and coalitions, we always look for, someone from justice and someone from education and someone from the seniors group, but also recognizing that there are people out there who have no affiliation with groups and in very important ways are stakeholders, just like the people who would be included in those sectors. The process of community development is very important, and it's often very, very slow. I was on a webinar last week, and when someone said, and I thought this was really poignant, she said that community building moves at the speed of trust. And I think that just speaks to how important relationship building is when you do any of this work with communities. And I think in all of our work as social workers. Each community is unique, regardless of where we work and regardless of your definition of community. On this webinar last week, I'm stealing her quotes. This presenter also said, when you have seen one community, you have seen one community. So again, just a recognition of the fact that all of the communities that we work in have their own very unique strengths and challenges. And also, engagement is giving and receiving. And I know in a lot of our work, we're out with communities or out with clients and we're doing consultations and we're trying to gather feedback and gather data. But really important that when we go out and do this gathering and all of this consultation, oftentimes for our own purposes, it's important to return to communities and to clients with your data to validate it. And then in some way, and hopefully in a meaningful way, that we close the loop. This is a fairly new tool that I did just see recently, and it's a great tool when we look at how we engage citizens, and it's called I think I'm pronouncing it right, the Arnstein Ladder of Citizen Participation, developed in the 1960s. The basic premise here is that there are really varying ways that we approach people and communities, and when we are looking at decision making and policy development. And obviously at the very bottom of the ladder, where we don't want to be, is non-participation. Example there they've used is manipulation. I know that might sound a little bit mean-spirited, but sometimes I know hopefully in the past that's been a tool that's been used when we engage with communities. Moving up the ladder a little bit better, we have tokenism. An example there that they've used is informing, so going out to communities and clients and just saying, here's some information for you, do with it what you will. And then really the top of the ladder where we all hope to get at some point, not easy, but we hope to get to citizen control and partnerships and delegated power, where we're actually working very authentically with communities and where community members are very authentically involved. This ladder I know looks very simple and it's very linear, and I do want to put in the caveat that obviously it's not always as simple as this, but definitely a tool we can use. Some of the foundations for really authentic engagement, and similar to those ones we talked about with community development, we want to be transparent, be honest when you work with communities about what your purpose is, to recognize all expertise again. And I'll say this, and I apologize repetitively throughout the presentation, that we don't want to just look at sectors, we want to look at people and respect varied perspectives. This is an interesting one and sometimes a very difficult one, but to understand power, not just the power of the people who we're working with, as important as that is, and how they use it, especially when you're looking at a coalition, but also how we use our own power as members of groups and oftentimes as leaders of coalitions and groups to ensure contribution. Some of this work can sometimes be very operational, and that's the nature of it sometimes, depending on our purpose, but to always make sure that if we can, in some way, create some space for contribution. Again, to welcome diverse perspectives, and also mentioned in the last slide that we close the loop. So we get back into a community and work with them to make sure that we've finished up our work with them in a way that works for them. I couldn't do this presentation without mentioning asset-based community development, and really it's as simple as it sounds. It's working with communities in a way that looks at their strengths. I'll just read out the definition really quickly. Asset-based community development, or ABCD as it's most often known, it looks for and starts from people's gifts and strengths or assets, and these assets equip people to create local opportunities and then to respond to the needs and challenges in their neighborhood. This approach has been around for many years, and as social workers I know we're taught, rightfully so, to focus on strengths as opposed to deficits, and this is where this approach really lies. The basic premise of ABCD is that not that people and communities have deficiencies and needs, which is often where we focus. I know in the early days of my social work career, and even now when we go into communities, we're often looking at, what do you need? What don't you have? Why isn't there a doctor in the community? Or why aren't people more physically active? Whereas this approach focuses more on people and communities and their assets and their capacities. And again, it's not doing for the community, it's doing with the community. And I wanted to include this really neat example of a community assets map. And these assets maps, if you Google them or look for them online in any way, you'll see there are a million different versions of how to do an assets map. And this is a nice looking one. I remember a long time ago doing one of these in the community of St. Mary's, and we basically just had a flip chart sheet and did a list of all of the gifts that were available in that community and all of the capacities. At the heart of this, you'll see, and I'm sure everyone would agree, are the gifts of individuals. And then it also looks almost in a square here, but a circular fashion, at all of the institutions and associations and groups that are out there that really bring so many gifts and assets to your community. And I know if anyone on this call thinks of your own community, be it an urban place or a rural community, I'm sure you'd be able to develop a really great inventory of the gifts of the people and groups in your own place. So now, here we go. This is the bulk of the presentation today. And again, and I apologize because I know what it's like to be on a call and you're seeing all these slides. I will intersperse the slides with some examples as we go along, just so we can get a little break from the wordy slides. So basically, what is a coalition? And I think we all work with coalitions, and they're definitely not just the realm of community development. And I'm sure a lot of people on this call have worked with coalitions, even in your clinical work. And basically, when I think of a coalition, I think it's just basically a group of groups. So it's an alliance or partnering of groups in order to achieve a common goal or to engage in a joint activity. They exist to bring attention, oftentimes, and action to a larger goal that affects many people. And the process is it really happens when parties come together to form the coalition with other groups who have similar values and interests and goals. And really, in a neat way, it allows the members to combine their resources and become more effective than if they had acted alone. Lots of reasons to build coalitions, to bring those groups together. You can achieve more, obviously, than you can when you work alone, especially if you're working towards a similar goal. This is an important one. It allows for safer advocacy efforts, and it really depends, I think, on the type of coalition you're working with. If you have a coalition made up of groups in the community who have little government affiliation, then oftentimes their advocacy efforts can be completed in a way that's just a little easier because they're not affiliated with a group that has limiting control in that way. And sometimes we all know that advocacy, depending on where we work, can feel a little bit unsafe and unwelcome. So in coalitions, when groups come together, oftentimes it makes that advocacy seem a little bit safer. Again, magnifies resources. Those groups are bringing together a variety of resources that they have used in terms of staff and time, sometimes equipment. It reduces duplication. Oftentimes groups are working on the exact same initiative, and when they come together, they're able to take away that duplication. It helps develop new leadership skills amongst members and facilitates exchange of all kinds of new information and skills and experience. And also, finally, brings together a diverse range of people and organizations, which oftentimes, with that diversity of groups and people, fosters some really neat creativity. So here's our first example. You'll notice that a lot of these examples are from the area that I'm in and I've always worked in, which is the Placentia area and the Cape Shore. And this example comes from, again, a group called Community Connections. So here at Eastern Health, and I know if you're on this call and connected to or work with the health authority, we have community advisory committees. And basically, those committees inform Eastern Health on local strengths and needs and priorities. The Community Connections Group was one of the very early community advisory committees that started way back in 2005. And they've really led a lot of interesting initiatives. They are made up of a variety of groups: seniors groups, historical society, the food bank, community youth network. So a lot of different groups that form that coalition. And two examples here of work that they've done. There was a program in Eastern Health, and we don't have it anymore, but I think the rest of the province would have it. And it was called Improving Health My Way, Chronic Disease. It was a chronic disease self-management program. And we had completed that program here in the Placentia area for quite some time. And at the end of the program, we found that people were really feeling like, okay, we've learned all this great information about self-management of our chronic conditions, and we really got to know each other very well as a group, but now what? So this coalition was really instrumental in kind of starting a part 2 of that, and they had a support group called Better Together for about a year. And that support group brought together people who had been in that program and others to continue support around chronic disease self-management, and really just general support. The other initiative that they are still planning would be, so this poster comes from Ireland, and it's Darkness into Light, and it's a walk to bring awareness around mental health challenges. And so this is one of those things that got lost a little in the pandemic, and so it's been planned now for probably a year and a half. We're hoping to do it this summer. So anyway, just 2 examples of initiatives that this committee has worked on. As I prepared for this presentation, I wondered if I should keep this slide in, because the other side of this coalition building example is that Community Connections no longer exists. They're still working, some people on the committee are still working on the Darkness into Light walk, but I use this example anyway as an example of the fact that coalitions, as great as they are, and as long-standing as many of them are, like this one, they're not always going to exist forever, and sometimes they're not sustainable. And sometimes, well, that happens for a variety of reasons. And I think in this situation, it did happen because the members of the coalition members, the groups who formed this coalition, really had other opportunities and other priorities within their own groups that they wanted to work on. So this group has folded into another committee. Some members have left, some members have moved on, but when they did exist, they certainly did great work as a group. So some considerations on how you build a strong coalition. Of course, very important to identify like-minded groups, organizations with similar goals and interests. And I know it is important to bring people together who have similar goals, but sometimes it is interesting when a group decides to join a coalition who might seem like a bit of an outlier, but at the same time, once they start the relationship building within the coalition, you can see the connection that they would have. Important to be strategic, but not too strategic, and to allow space for people to build relationships within your group, and also for the process to unfold. You might have a coalition where people really and truly don't know one another. They don't know the work of each other's group. They don't know what their mandate is. And then on a more personal level, they just don't know each other as human beings. So as anxious as we are to get those goals met, I think it's important to allow some time for that process. Important also, really great to understand and respect that each member has their own self-interest. And you know, when you go to a meeting, it's inevitable that we're oftentimes told, when you're especially in a coalition, to take off your hat. It's not always easy to take off your hat. If you've been looking for funding for a new park in your community, or for mental health funding, or for, it could be a million examples, a community garden, and you're joining this community health coalition, then you know, it's important to recognize that people come in with some really important initiatives that they've been working on, and to recognize why they've come to this group or coalition. Again, be thoughtful with your tactics, and really the tactics that you're going to use, as many as we have in our toolboxes, they should really fit the groups involved. Recognize that contributions of those groups may vary. You might have a group of 5 people from a little community, and in coalition with a very large organization. So, you know, groups may not be able to contribute the same resources. And then also, at the end of the day, when you have your project completed, or you're getting to the point where you're meeting that goal, to distribute the credit fairly. Is it easy? It's not always easy, but it's worth it. And I don't think that's any surprise to anyone here. Sometimes it is challenging to agree on common objectives, because sometimes it's hard to take off that hat that we talked about when you come from different perspectives and different groups. It takes time to develop these coalitions. Again, we talked about power distribution may be difficult, especially sometimes if you have some really strong-willed groups who've been working on something for a while and they're just coming in to basically get some help to get that goal met. Important to compromise and create a process for decision-making. Shared decision-making can take time when you're working with a group of groups. to understand who gets the credit and how that happens, and also important to build in some type of evaluation that everyone can agree on right from the beginning. Now, easy enough to say all of this as I'm saying it to you, but it's not always things that we think about, especially if we're putting a group together. A group is coming together very quickly for a shared goal. This example of a coalition is from Ontario, and it's a very, very, very exciting example. So this is Health Providers Against Poverty, or HPAP Ontario, and their goal is to eliminate poverty through social and political change. And in terms of being a coalition, they're made up of various health disciplines in Ontario. They do some amazing advocacy work. You can find them online, and you can sign up for their on their listserv, and you get a lot of their material around health equity and all of the really monumental work and tasks that they are doing to bring to light the connection between income and health in Ontario. There was a startup of HPAP Newfoundland and Labrador a few years ago. I can't tell you if it's still ongoing, but at the time there was some really big interest in starting a similar group here in Newfoundland and Labrador. Another example, keep going back to Placentia. I feel like I'm the tourism commercial this morning for Placentia and Cape Shore. I call this one Live from Placentia because this is truly an ongoing example of coalition building. So it's live, I think, because we're still forming, and we in this area are working on housing security. And we formed a community advisory board, which is now a little bit, we're getting older. It's probably a couple of years old, but we're still in that forming stage where committees and groups are starting to go off and come back on and move around a little bit. And so some of the examples of the people we have, or groups that are on this coalition, would be our community advisory committee. The town is on there, along with the food bank and Eastern Health. And interesting in terms of as our goals change with the group and as our funding opportunities change, we're really seeing how the committees that are on the coalition are starting to move back and forth. So again, it's still live, and we're hoping that we can soon stabilize a little. So what makes coalitions strong and effective? Again, we've talked about a lot of this stuff already. Really important that we look at diversity, that we be thoughtful in our planning, that our collaboration be meaningful. So we're not just working together for the sake of it. So an example I often think about is, and we'll talk about this at the end of the presentation, we're probably halfway through now, but municipalities are often encouraged quite a bit in this day and age to work together to get funding. And I know that's not just true of municipalities, it's true of a lot of groups. And it's important, obviously, to get funding, but if we're working with groups in that type of situation and building a coalition, to make sure that it's still meaningful for the people who are involved. That you have a work plan, first of all, and that it be living, so that it's not, just this static document that can't change, but that it changes based on what's happening with the committee. And probably my favorite, that you invite unusual suspects. So again, it's going back to those sectors. So there are groups out there and people out there who you may not, or your coalition may not automatically go to in terms of membership, but that would be hugely important in bringing a perspective that you might not have for your coalition. I smile when I look at this slide as I look up at this bearded man up in the corner, and this is John McKnight, and he is truly the guru of asset-based community development. John McKnight started, I think it is called the Asset-Based, I don't know if it's the ABCD Institute, I think it is, but if you Google him, you'll find it. And most of his work was with inner city neighborhoods in Chicago. I really would encourage you to look at his website and Google him and look up any work that you can find on him. There's a lot of YouTube videos. And he is, he's the founder of the term of association of associations, which is really, in essence, what a coalition is. But we'll talk a little bit more about him towards the end. And one more example we have, actually I think I have one more after this. So talking about municipalities and your communities and your areas in the province, you may have, I hope you do, have joint councils. So this one is on the other side of where I am, over on the southern shore. And this Joint Council is made up as truly a coalition. It's made up of a variety of towns, municipalities, and the Southern Shore. I think they stretch from, if you look at the map, from St. Schatz, right at the bottom of the Avalon Peninsula, right up towards Bay Bulls. And this one is close to my heart, very close to my heart, because as a former mayor, I had rallied quite a bit for the idea of a joint council, and we did have one, and it was really neat to see how bringing together different communities and our different perspectives from all these different geographies really made a difference in terms of lobbying government when we had a shared goal. This one, I have to point out to you though, is a very progressive joint council, because when they meet, not only do they look at their municipal goals and objectives, but oftentimes they have invited health authorities and different people related to community health in to present to them on different priorities that exist in their communities. Now, my technological skills, hopefully I can bring this one up for you. So this, hopefully you can see my screen. I'm not sure if you can. If not, you could follow that link in the slides. It's the Eastern Regional Wellness Coalition. And the Wellness Coalition is an initiative, or I guess a program in some ways, of Eastern Health. And again, I know they exist and they're very precious throughout the province, and they do some really great work around bringing together different groups. So our Wellness Coalition here in Eastern focuses on the rural Eastern region. And we have, I think, almost 250 groups that would form the coalition. And really they focus on helping coalition members to share resources and find resources and grants and different educational opportunities. And they have been around for quite some time. So a really great example of a coalition. And finally, I guess this is really why all of this is so important. So in terms of a connection to health, effective coalitions, so when it's done right, they really should lead in our world to action on the determinants of health. And determinants of health are really all of those factors that determine whether or not a community is, or a person is healthy or not. And coalitions can really take action on the determinants of health by shining a spotlight on issues and advocating for change as a united group, as opposed to an individual or one group advocacy. In terms of, again, how all of this connects back to health, we would hope that effective coalitions would allow us, all of our communities, to have the same opportunities for good health, which is really the essence of health equity. And as I'm sure you've seen this diagram before, but this diagram really shows us how important those determinants are. As important, as hugely important as healthcare is and access to services, it really does only account for about 20% of our health status. And when we look up here at the head and shoulders of this little person, we can see that those socioeconomic factors, most of which really are the determinants of health, account for 40% or almost half of our health. So hopefully when we work with coalitions, and when coalitions are really effective, it can get up to this part of those socioeconomic factors and really make a difference. So kind of getting to the end here now, and I know we have loads and loads of time, but what I've learned in my work with all of this is that coalition building is challenging, but the rewards are enormous when those coalitions work together very well. That the connection between united and varied groups and health is key to change. I've said from day one, one of my biggest learnings, I suppose, in all of this work is that communities are the ones that really enact change when we need it to happen. I've learned how important it is to be inclusive, and again, that those unusual suspects on our groups, if it's just a group or if it's a group of groups as a coalition, can really make all the difference in the world. And very important, have fun, because all this work can be very serious. So it's important to have fun, get to know the people in your groups and know them as human beings, and also have a bond. At a call recently, we talked about the great bond freeze of, I think it might have been 2013, but we had, and I suppose in some ways we still have it, but we weren't allowed really to have any food or any beverages or anything at our committee. So it has changed, thankfully, for us quite a bit in the last few years. Important to bring people together around food. It always makes such a good, positive difference. Some resources I wanted to pass along. that would be helpful for any of this work, we have our own group here in terms of the Centre for Applied Health Research, and I've just done a presentation with them, I think yesterday, and they're doing some great work around this initiative with social prescribing. So if anyone is interested in that, I'm sure you can sign up for the webinars. The Tamarack Institute, who are really just a great group of people looking at all types of aspects of community development and community engagement. I wanted to throw out that they are having an online conference October 6th and October 7th, and you can Google them as well. I mentioned John McKnight. He has a really great book called The Abundant Community. I think he has 3 or 4 books, but this is, I think, his most recent one. I apologize for not having the links, but these are really easy to find. There's a community toolbox that some of you might have seen online with some really good community engagement tools. Michael Marmot, similar to John McKnight, I think he might be the edgy version of John McKnight in the United Kingdom, has done some exceptional work on health equity. And finally, there's the Mosaic Lab, which is out of Australia, and you can sign up there, and they send some really exciting and new resources around community engagement. I always have to end a presentation with a few good quotes, and the one I'm sure you've heard, the Margaret Mead quote, that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world, because it really is the only thing that ever has. And I would say the same thing about thoughtful, committed groups. And probably one of my favorites, it's on my wall here in my office. It says, "Rise up with me against the organization of misery," which is a quote that Michael Marmot had used in one of his reports, which originally came from, I think, Pablo Neruda. So with all of that said, and I'm sure you're sick of my voice at this point, I'm going to pass over the mic to Annette to see if anyone has any questions or ideas. Thank you very much, everyone.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for Priscilla for this excellent presentation. We do have lots of time for questions and answers, so please send in your questions. Just use that question mark icon at the bottom of your screen, the question mark one, and send in your questions there. One of the questions we do have, Priscilla, you mentioned a few times throughout the presentation of the unusual suspect. Just wondering, someone's wondering if you can give an example of who an unusual, of where that, an example of who an unusual suspect may have been, who did become part of a coalition and really enrich the work of that coalition. Are you able to share an example?
Yeah, there's one example that always stands out, and I apologize if unusual sounds in any way offensive, because I don't mean it to be offensive. I guess unusual in the terms of someone or a group that we wouldn't usually think of inviting in. So in one of our coalitions we'd started to form a coalition, and we had the comment from one of the leaders and the group that we really should only be inviting people who were very educated, professional people who had possibly retired and who had a lot of time and a lot of expertise to give to us. Now, obviously, that wasn't a sensible approach. So nobody agreed. So we decided, we were just going to put out a call to anyone and everyone who had wanted to come be part of this group. We did end up getting mostly people who did fit that profile of people who are retired and different professional people. But we did have someone who came on the group who had a lot of challenges around mental health and a lot of challenges around housing. And nobody on that group really would have been able to speak to how health inequity had impacted their lives, but he could. And he was very willing to share his life story with us and share his current situation. And by doing that and inviting this person in and really making him feel welcome, I think that completely changed the whole flow and whole workings of our committee. And I'll be honest to say that I do believe that it led to the beginnings of the housing coalition that we currently have now in this area. So I think that was one of my light bulb moments in terms of inviting someone in and creating space for their presence that made a positive difference.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Thanks, Priscilla. Another question just came in. Someone acknowledges, want to say great presentation. And they're wondering what the impacts COVID-19 has had on community engagement and coalition building, and how have you been able to address some of those challenges?
That's a really good question. We've really struggled, like most people who are involved in this type of work. We've struggled because we couldn't see each other face to face. So I would say well over half of the groups that I'll be involved with have seen a decline in membership throughout the pandemic. So we still had our meetings and we still had Zoom calls and tried to use all the technology we could and tried to be creative with it. But at the same time, we could see that the meetings were, I think, people were a little bit less engaged, probably because they had, everybody was worried about, and still is worried about the pandemic. And we did have some people who said to us that we won't be involved for now. We're not going to leave, but we'll be involved when we can see each other face to face again. So I think what it did, it stalled a little bit of our work, but it didn't stop it. So hopefully when we get back to a little bit more normal in the fall, we'll be able to have people back face to face. And I think we should be able to start up fairly well again.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Another question that we've had is in terms of how do you deal with any negativity or pessimism that you may encounter in coalitions?
I think it's almost inevitable to have negativity because, when groups come together in these coalitions, sometimes they've been really fighting for a long time and trying to meet a goal. So, it is inevitable that they come in and feel almost a little bit beaten down, even when they come in to join the coalition. And I always try, and I think the group members who are there who have that mindset, I always try to welcome people and make sure that they really get the message that now that we're together as a group of groups, that we have so many more resources and such a better chance of achieving our goals together. And also, I suppose, again, taking that time for relationship building, because we're always, me included, we're always so rushed sometimes with these groups, want to get everybody together and get that work created and meet our goals, but to just allow that time for people to get to know who everyone is around the table. And you can encounter, I don't like to use the word resistance, but you can encounter some resistance around that because not everybody is there to make new friends and to have, to tell people where they're from and a little bit about their lives. So I guess there's a balance there with that, but I think allowing some space for that when people get together at the beginning helps a lot.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Another question is around the social determinants of health. So we know that there's growing awareness around the social determinants of health. Do you feel the work you are engaged in Placentia has fostered a greater awareness amongst the community around the social determinants of health?
I think it has. I don't think that most people would talk about in their conversations in these groups, don't talk a lot about the determinants of health and actually use that language that we would all use. But I think that they do see and almost demand that the work that we're doing has an impact and impacts what's important to their community. So in this area, housing, because Placentia is so close to and has been close to some mega projects over the years, housing has been such a huge issue in this area. So as that piece of impacting our health, I think that's something that really has needed to be worked on for a long time. People really appreciate that. That's something that we focused on for the last little while.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. Have another question around, so this person is in clinical, more clinical social practice, and wondering if you have any suggestions on how they can incorporate some of the principles of community engagement in their practice.
Yeah, that's such an interesting topic, and it's something that I'm trying to work through myself. I'm definitely not in clinical practice, but in terms of working with health centers and with people who are in different disciplines in clinical practice, I think in a very, very important, and maybe in kind of a smaller way, to be able to work with people, and I know you're working one-on-one oftentimes with people, but to think about the setting that you're working in and trying to figure out how there can be even some small coalition building around, or even group building around the people that use services. And I know right off the top of my head, I'm thinking about evaluation of services and how people experience the services that we provide, but even in a bigger setting in terms of, or in a bigger way in terms of what's happening in their community and how we can address that. And I think even in clinical roles, we have such huge, knowledge bases around how people are operating in their spheres in their communities. And I know that might sound like such a convoluted answer, but it is something I've been thinking about for a while and trying to figure out how we can incorporate that a little bit more into clinical practice. And just as an example, I know for the places where I'm starting to work a little bit now, when I go into these clinics and talk about coalition building and community development, I think everyone would see that as a half, which is half of my job, and not really connected to a place where nurse practitioners are providing service or where doctors are seeing patients. But I think there are ways for us to bring this work into those sites and to start to look at how we can have that kind of umbrella of community development even in those type of places. But anyway, I apologize. That wasn't. I don't think that was the answer, but something definitely for all of us to think about.
No, that was a great answer. Thanks, Priscilla. Another question that we've had is around. You mentioned earlier about having an evaluation plan. So can you speak a little bit more about what coalition building and community engagement, how it's evaluated in terms of what's being looked at?
Yeah, I think this is probably one of the hardest pieces of coalition building, because I know when all of the groups through my work life so far get together, they have no real interest at the beginning, especially in evaluation. And we've used some very simple techniques around evaluation, very simple things, very important ones like focus groups and questionnaires. One of our groups actually did a survey with Eastern Health, with our research department, around the work that they've been doing around mental health. So they did more of a formal survey. But that was something that was a kind of, how would I put it? It wasn't pushed upon us, but it was something that was part of the funding that we had received. So, and we've also tried to use some participatory approaches when we've tried to do evaluation. But again, I think something that I know all the groups that I have worked with have struggled with in terms of how do you do it. So hugely important, but right off the top, it's just not something that people are thinking about. But the more and more that we build it into the beginning phases of our development, and also the more that we use it as a condition of funding, which seems to becoming more and more important, and I think we'll start to see more evaluation built in.
Mm-hmm. Perfect, thank you. Another question we have is around, the community engagement piece and how responsive have community members been to this work, and what has been their level of engagement?
I think we've seen varying levels of engagement based on community. So we just did a series of community consultations about 2 years ago. And I have to say, I'm used to going to community sessions where, like, if 10 people showed up, you're over the moon, and you have 10 people, such a big deal. And you have the richest conversation, obviously, with the 10 people or 5 people who show up. And not always that we have smaller groups, but lots of times we do. But we did have one community where we had 150 people who were there on site immediately when the session started. And then we had to use, I can't remember what we did, but it was a chaotic system of trying to get people in within the far limits of the arena that we were in. And I only use that example to say that sometimes it depends on what's happening in the community in terms of how engaged they are. And especially for consultation purposes, that community had really big issues with medical services at the time, and they wanted some answers from Eastern Health. So I think they felt like they needed to get out and have their voices heard. So I think it is sometimes contextual. And if there's nothing happening in the community and people feel like everything is pretty good, then sometimes it is harder to get people out. But for the coalitions, oftentimes I do find that there's always a goal or something that people are working on with similar interests, and they wanted a way to come together as a coalition, and sometimes they're just waiting for someone to come in and start that process with them, and then they're good to go.
Perfect, thank you. And one of your slides, you mentioned, the work of community advisory committees. Can you explain a little bit more about what those committees would be doing in terms of their work and scope? And
yeah, so they right now we have about 9 community advisory committees, and they exist in big geographies and small ones. So we have one here in the Placentia Cape Shore area, which will be a population of about 3,000 people, and then we have the Burin Peninsula, which I can't tell you the population, but it's very big and a huge geography, and they each community advisory committee has its own set of terms of reference, all very similar, and they basically look at what's happening in the community, what are the needs, what are the strengths and priorities, and develop an action plan that really addresses what's happening in the community. So the Bjorn Peninsula will be no surprise. Their focus has been mental health now for some time. This area here, the Placentia Cape Shore area, are starting to look at. It's interesting because their priorities were mostly around awareness of community resources, but as service levels have changed here, they're starting to move a little bit more to that 20% part of that little person with access to services, and other communities just different priorities. I'm trying to think what Bonavista is also looking at access to services, and Bell Island is a good example. Just before the pandemic, Bell Island was starting to plan a fair focused on resources related to mental health and wellness on Bell Island and within Eastern Health. So it really depends on what the community decides are their priorities, and then they develop their planning around that. But really coalitions in that they are made up of, oftentimes, most of the time, different groups within the community. But, you do have people on those committees who aren't affiliated with any organizations and still there as well.
Mm-hmm. Oh, thank you. I just want to remind people that they can type their questions or comments into the question mark icon. You still have a little bit of time, so feel free to do that. Our next question kind of relates to the question we had around negativity and pessimism. But in terms of effective ways of dealing with conflicting community priorities. So I know you mentioned shared decision making, but in terms of when there's conflicting about what the priorities are, what are some tips for working through some of those issues?
Yeah, and that's a really hard one, and it's a common one because in some ways when these coalitions come together, they do come together under the umbrella of or the shared belief that they're working towards a similar goal. But when people get together or the groups get together and they have that chance to really flesh out why they've come to the table, and the goals may be a little bit different and they may not be leaning in the same direction. So, at the risk of being repetitive, I really think that allowing for that slowness of those early days of coming together makes a big difference, because you come in with that flip chart on day one and just start to, decide that you're going to do brainstorming and do your action plan, and not allow some time for really meaningful conversation about why people have decided to attend and why they've taken their very important time to be a part of this group, and really come to some consensus in a way that's guided. And this may sound old-fashioned, guided by some of those important, very basic principles of any meeting and any group of people come together. Then I think that makes a difference in the long term, because a lot of these, my frame of reference for all of this is rural, and you have people coming together who have oftentimes known each other for many years, groups who have worked on and off together for many years, and sometimes in confrontational ways, sometimes in very peaceful ways. So I think you have to really look at all of those considerations and understand those as well, especially if you're going to be in any type of leadership role with that group. Mm-hmm. That's a principle in itself.
Okay, thank you. This is a question I had, Priscilla, just wondering if I could ask it here as well. But of course, we know that there's work ongoing with the Health Accord here in the province. And just from your experience in community engagement and coalition building, what do you feel is needed in terms of healthcare reform, in terms of enhancing people's health based on, the work that you've been engaged in?
Yeah. It's such an interesting time in it, because a year ago, before the pandemic, I would have my whole world was connected to all of this work in community health and community engagement. And it's only in the last year that I've been, I want to say, tangled up with clinics and medical services, and to see that side of how all of it works. And I think I'm totally in love with Dr. Parfrey and Sister Elizabeth and their ideas around population health and how we have to be more focused on the determinants of health. And I think that has been coming for a very long time. And I also know that we do have to balance out the need for services, so that when you go to a community, if I went to any of these communities tomorrow and talked about these very beautiful ideas around population health and upstream approaches, and didn't focus and some of the services that they've said that they really require in their communities, I think they would just say, well, they throw me out, because that's in lots of communities, that's really not where people are right now. So I think we have a lot of work to do to show people in very meaningful ways that little person in that slide, that this is where health lies, and this is really what impacts your health most dramatically. And I think there are creative ways to do that. And I suppose where my head lies mostly on it, Annette, is around income, because I have a very special interest in income and health. And I think we need to start to look at, how individuals in this province, at the risk of sounding controversial, are expected to live on such a low income and still be healthy at the same time. So I would hope there's some special attention paid to that connection.
Yeah, I agree, Priscilla. I've read some things that income is probably the biggest determiner of health, in accounting for health outcomes. So certainly agree with your thought there around, a focus on income as well. Yeah. So I'm just looking at the questions. I don't see any other questions coming in. So Priscilla, did you have any final last words that you wanted to raise before we move into the conclusion?
No, I guess just another thank you to you, Annette, and for inviting me to be here today, and for everyone for listening. I know I'm at my desk, and I know you're at all your desks, and you have a million desks waiting when you get off this call. I'd also like to say, Annette, that if anyone has, any questions or would like to, share some ideas or resources that you would have, Annette has my email. I'll just give you my email now. So it's priscilla.mooney, Mooney, @easternhealth.ca. So I'd love to hear from anyone who has ideas or thoughts around any of this.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Priscilla. And really thank you for this excellent and stellar presentation this afternoon, and for sharing your knowledge, expertise, and experience in coalition building and community engagement with us this afternoon. And we hope that this information has provided you with some new information that you can integrate into your practice or ways of thinking about, what's happening in our communities. And it's certainly very timely, given the work of the Health Accord, to transform healthcare service delivery through the framework of the social determinants of health. Priscilla, I've thoroughly enjoyed working with you over the years. It's been a while since we last connected, and I'm always impressed and so thankful for the passion that you bring to your community practice, which is always so inspiring. And I learned so much from you today, and I thank you for taking time from your busy schedule to facilitate this continuing education webinar. These sessions would not be possible without the involvement of social workers like yourself, who without question offer to do this for your social work colleagues. The PDF of the PowerPoint presentation and the link to the Eastern Health Coalition that Priscilla mentioned in her presentation is available on the resource section of the webinar platform. Just want to remind members that you may claim one CPE credit under the required category of workshops as per the NLCSW CPE policy for attending the webinar. And we also ask that you complete the evaluation form that should appear on your screen as the webinar ends, because your feedback is always so greatly appreciated. So thanks again, everyone. Thank you, Priscilla. Enjoy the rest of your day and stay safe.
Thanks, everyone.